And finally, we will this week look at Napoleonic France. And once Napoleon takes over, he quickly begins to uh, change the French government and change it in ways that benefit himself. First of all, he names himself consul for life in 1801. Which basically makes it so that the other consuls are no longer important, and he is the sole power in France. Afterwards, he's going to curb the power of the church after um, many disagreements with Pope Pius VII. Pope Pius will be sufficiently cowed before Napoleon, and he will basically follow along with whatever Napoleon wants, because Napoleon is the only real strong Catholic force left in the on the continent. You have Spain has basically dwindled, and you have England being this very strong force by the turn of the 19th century, and so you see. Um, you see Pope Pius VII basically give in to whatever Napoleon wants. You also have the beginning of the Code Napoleon, uh, which will um, which will bring in revolutionary ideals. This is the new legal code for France, which will bring in revolutionary ideals and codify them into law. And so basically, Napoleon co-ops the French Revolution and puts those ideas into play, which assuage some fears of some people, but basically he's just doing it to solidify his power. And then he's going to also create a meritocracy. This new loyal upper class is going to give his loyal soldiers or his loyal followers a land and titles. And so Napoleon will basically set himself up as the leader with everybody happy around him. You will have the uh, very left wing, logic minded people, as they would call themselves, happy that he curbs the power of the church. You'll have the more moderate revolutionaries happy that he um, puts in the revolutionary ideals into the Napoleon, and then he will create a meritocracy which will make some of the nobility and definitely his new nobility into a into this lower upper class. So he's made most people happy, and then he understands that he also has to make the people love him from the very beginning, and he creates this reformed education that puts French into the spotlight, that makes French the epitome of reason thought and of learned thought. And so you see this education that says that everything has led up to this moment, that everything has about France has led them to this point, that none of what they've done is bad, that anyone that says different is creating a false history. So this real patriotic education's patriotic history is fed to people. This is why us historians really don't like to hear the term patriotic history, because basically it glosses over any of the bad things that France has done, including slavery, and it just says that they are the most noble and the most civilized of nations. So with these reforms in place, with his power almost absolute, you have the beginning of the Empire of France, where Napoleon moves from being consul for life in 1801 to becoming Emperor Napoleon in 1804. And this angers many of the people around him, as they basically fear that he's just going to begin a march towards war. And so preemptively, preemptively, the British will declare war in 1805, and he will be uh, defeated by the British at Trafalgar under Admiral Nelson in 1805. And because of this, the British are once again the biggest and the best force in in the world at this a naval force at this point. It turns into a ground war instead, and so um, Napoleon is basically going to expand the his control um, over Europe, as you can see, starting with France, 1799. He's going to move and take most of Italy, um, most of the Confederation of the Rhine, which is part of the old Holy Roman Empire. Um, he's going to take over Spain, and basically the eventually he'll take over parts of what is now Austria and parts of the what is now Belgium, as well as the Papal States, and so he will basically control everything on the continent of Europe, and this will cut off Britain's access to the continent. This is known as the continental system, and so he will basically control everything, and it will take a lot to get rid um, of Napoleon's control. If only he does as long as he doesn't do anything dumb, Napoleon can control the entire continent of Europe, and then probably move into the Ottoman Empire and down into Asia and basically create a new empire that would rival Alexander's, that would quickly take over much more than Alexander. And all he has to do is not do anything dumb, and all that has to happen is that the British don't get into another fight that ends with their great victory. And that's what happens in 1812. You have the war between the United States and the British, and you have Napoleon turning to Russia. First, let's look at the War of 1812. The origins of this war are, first of all, you have trade restrictions between the United States and continental Europe. The um, British begin to blockade the continent from American ships, so Americans can't really trade with the French or with anyone else that they would want to, and this angers the Americans greatly. Then you have the British supporting Native Americans as the British in Canada are seeing the Americans encroach closer and closer to Canada into Canadian lands. They begin to ally with the natives of the native tribes and begin to pay the native tribes to attack Americans. And also they begin to tell them that, well, if you continue to help us, we'll make sure the Americans don't continue to move onto your lands. Also, the United States actually looks to invade Canada at some point, especially British Columbia, as the American forces move westward. They look to invade the British Columbia, excuse me, on the western coast to sort of create a bigger American empire on the continent. Um, but what really seals the deal is that the British Navy begins to seize U.S. sailors. The British Navy takes U.S. sailors and begins to conscript them because every British-born citizen is can be conscripted and put into the army or navy as they see fit, and a lot of these sailors don't have their birth certificate or passport with them at that time, and so basically the British say, well, you're a British citizen. Can you prove you're not? No, you can't. Okay, you're a British citizen. Now you are working on our ships. And so this is the last straw, and it leads to war being declared on June 18th, 1812. And for the first part of it, the British are busy fighting against the French, and so the Canadian forces have to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and the Canadians come in and with help of the British forces and the combined British and Canadian forces almost actually defeat the U.S. They burned down the original White House. They took over D.C. And had it not been for Napoleon being a much more important target, the British could have taken the Americans back. But instead, you have a peaceful solution where the British and um, uh, sorry, I should say the British and Americans become British and Americans. Excuse me. British and Americans begin to become allies. There you go. The British and Americans become allies, and this begins a new era of peace for the United States and the UK that really lasts to this day. And then, however, the Native Americans are going to suffer greatly uh, in this regard, as they will once again be abandoned by the British, and they will be. This is where you will start seeing their forced relocation onto reservations, and the movement, the unrestricted movement of Americans onto their lands. So that's the War of 1812 with uh, the U.S. and the United Kingdom's now allies once more. You have the French being put into a tough position where blocking the British from the continent doesn't have the same weight as it once did. And so, like I said, Napoleon could ostensibly continue to expand his empire as much as he wanted eastward, and not really have to deal with the British forces. But instead, he decides to move against the Russians. Tsar Alexander I gets tired of this continental system. He's tired of not being able um, to trade with whoever he wants. The English and the Russians have been trading since the rise uh, of Peter the Great, and so he basically says, "What's Napoleon going to do? Invade Russia?" And so he opens up Russian ports to the English to trade, and this causes Napoleon to march towards Russia. Napoleon brings with him 600,000 men and begins to march eastward. However, the Russians know a thing or two about fighting, and they know a thing or two about how to win even in defeat. And they basically scorch the earth in their retreat. They burn down their own crops, they kill their own livestock, they poison their own wells, because they understand that one of the main ways that armies operate in this era is that the armies, as they are moving, will take food and will take water from the places that they conquer, so they don't have to take with them as much equipment. They can refill as they go along, and the Russians don't allow the French to do that. Uh, However, even through all this, the French are going to capture Moscow on September 7th of 1812, and the Russian government escapes and moves further eastward. And instead of congratulating himself on a great victory, um, he's Napoleon's going to continue to march to march east, and he's going to eventually run into the Russian winter, and this Russian winter will decimate the army, and it will be what basically is his downfall as he's forced to retreat. And with of those 600,000 men that he took with him, only 50,000 men make their return to France. So he loses over 90% of his forces in this fight and comes back with a almost completely destroyed army. And so, with a almost completely destroyed army, the defeats are just going to mount for Napoleon. Napoleon is going to be defeated in 1814 and exiled um, to the island of Elba. And on this island of Elba, he's actually going to be allowed to write letters, to talk to whoever he wants. He's going to have a small armed force there watching over him, and he's going to basically convince everybody that he needs to be taken back to France to take over. And so he returns in 1815, and quickly takes control of the government once more and begins to fight again. And he will eventually, though, be defeated by an Anglo-Prussian alliance. So the English and the Prussians at the Battle of Waterloo will defeat him for the last time. And after this defeat at Waterloo, he will be exiled to Saint Helena, and there he will ultimately die. At this point, he's just given a secretary and like a rotating guard that doesn't really talk to him. And this is my favorite painting. It's a very sad Napoleon, but he's going to die in 1821 and will be moved to back to Paris eventually and buried in a very fancy coffin, a very fancy palace, and Napoleon will be revered. However, the Napoleonic Wars are going to take their toll on the world. The Europe is going to once again have to recover from a series of catastrophic wars, and the U.S. is going to be able to help them by trading with Europe, getting a lot of money, getting a lot of favorable deals while they give them the much needed natural resources that they need. And then basically Spain once again loses influence as Napoleon conquered them and deposed their king. And Spain has after this point, Spain will gain independence, but will then lose most of their colonial holdings as the colonial forces are going to rebel against them. So Spain loses influence, and the U.S. gains influence and becomes this new force, this new economic force that trades with Europe. Well, things really changed quickly here. Napoleon's back there losing in the Battle of Waterloo. So I hope you learned about the revolutions and a little bit more about how the Industrial Revolution has its beginnings as a agricultural revolution, how the American Revolution started out because of the specifics of taxation, and then why Europe is so important to the American Revolution, and then I hope you learned how the French aristocracy really led to their own downfall, and um, how the way that the Committee for Public Safety leads to the terror, and then leads to the rise of Napoleon, and basically Napoleon leads to his own downfall. So next week we're going to be looking more at the Industrial Revolution. We're going to see the beginning of nationalism and the beginning of new philosophies of economics, of science, and the ways that people are actually people. Like I said, I'm going to go check out the battle here and pour one out for poor Napoleon.